So thanks everybody, of course, for being here. I was going to send my bot, which would have been really much easier to get out of New York yesterday given the blizzard. But unfortunately, my bot hasn't risen yet. So that's why we're here, I guess. I was also going to wear the T-shirt because I think it's a great event, and obviously thanks to everybody who's putting it on. But then I discovered that you can't really mic up with a T-shirt. So there's some kind of like enforced formality. So I'm going to stand up here in a shirt. A little bit of arm waving exercise again for everyone who didn't do the arm waving this morning, just so I get a bit of a feel for the room. Who here would consider themselves to be more of the operations side of things? Oh, yeah, okay. And the other arm exercise, development? Oh, management? Like, don't worry, nothing bad will happen. Or this, I am not thinking, okay, so thanks. So that was almost 100% of the room. That's good. And maybe one final question. So who here is doing Agile development? Oh, a bunch. Who is considering that they would be doing CI? Uday will be happy with that one for sure. CD? Okay, well, good. Okay, so thanks very much. I think then we have some interesting material here. So obviously, what I'm going to talk about, the title of the talk, Tools, Practices, and Culture of CD, what I'm going to try and do is to make this as relevant for the entire audience as possible. And I know, having spoken to some of you, that one of the big things that is happening within GE is that the transition to cloud. What does cloud mean for us? How are we going to make this work? And I think from the perspective of that, if you look at this talk, then maybe the thing you're going to get out of it most of all is to try to visualize some of the goals that you might be having for the initiative. Not just the immediate goals of we have to be able to get this application to run on 5 virtual machines in Amazon, but if we do that, what are some of the things that are then possible? And they may not mean that you have to do them immediately, but to try to obviously look beyond a particular technical initiative and to think a little bit more about what the actual goal is. So let's make this, slides are over there. Okay, so there's the about me slide, blah, blah, blah. You can skip most of that. The important thing, I guess, is that I'm a developer by background. Now I'm a VP of product management, which means I'm a PowerPoint developer professionally, which is rather disappointing, I have to say, but I still code between like 10 and 2 in the morning, which only works because my girlfriend's also a software developer, so she understands. I am not, obviously, so I work for XebiaLabs. We make a bunch of tools to try and help continuous delivery and DevOps at scale, and I will not talk about them at all beyond this slide. You can come to the Birds of a Feather session of my colleagues TJ and Marco here as well, but just so you know roughly what they do. So we have one tool that basically takes care of all the problems of getting your application layer and configuration, that important icing on the cake, running in whatever environment you need. We have a test aggregation analytics tool, actually, which is designed to try to help you with the problem of, well, now I have 900 automated tests and 800 different tools. How on earth do I make sense of this data set, especially if I'm generating it more and more rapidly? Manually making PowerPoint decks and sending them off to the development team isn't going to work if you run these tests once a day. And the final tool, XR Release, is really a pipeline orchestrator. So everything you need to do from the moment you've written the code to the moment you throw it over the edge into production, that's pretty much what it's designed to allow you to design, automate, and improve. So much for what we do. That's it from that perspective. So I will do a slightly more than lightning continuous delivery recap, given some of the hands that I've seen here, and then I'll try and talk a little bit about the tooling, practices, and culture that we see going along with those in different types of organizations. I think one of the big challenges, certainly for all you on a daily basis, is that it's all very well to go and read about what Etsy does, but GE isn't Etsy. And some of the things that work for GE can work, for Etsy can work for GE, and some of them can't. And I think, it's easy for me to say, look at what Etsy does, you should be doing this as well. The real challenge is, so what do we pick, what doesn't make sense, and how can we go about it? And I'll talk a bit about bootstrapping a CD culture. So that gets back to the why are we actually doing this? What can we get out of it, and what parts of this mentality can we incorporate in order to make smart choices? I'll talk a bit about one of the big pitfalls that I've seen a couple of times, which I call quick win chasm. And then, after all the very high-level theoretical stuff, I'll try and make it a bit more practical so you can go away with some practical things to talk about. In fact, if you've picked up one of those folders outside, it's got a little handout inside that are 5 things. You can hang it up on a wall. You can like tick them off as you get them done. And then when you get 5, you get a free t-shirt or something. I don't know. You speak to our VP marketing. She'll sort something out. All right. What is continuous delivery? So this is just the Wikipedia definition. There's a bunch out there. You'll have read this a few times if you've read about it. Continuous delivery is a set of patterns and best practices, basically, to make things go faster, better, cheaper. Well, who would say no to that? Yeah, I mean, who's going to stand up and say, well, we have this practice that makes your software worse, takes longer, and it costs more to deliver. Oh, actually, that's called waterfall. No, just joking. Anyway, so from the perspective of, that's being the definition to what you actually see when you speak to people on a day-to-day basis and you ask them, people will say, okay, yeah, we've built this delivery pipeline, so we're doing continuous delivery. So is it a pipeline? Is it a certain type of release process? To me, I mean, ultimately, a pipeline, as I said, those are typically all those steps that you do from the moment the code is written to the moment when it gets into production. And if you think about it, that is your release process by another name, just that they tend to be run by totally different parts of the organization with usually quite different mindsets. So is this just a way of rethinking releases? Is it some kind of methodology, some kind of philosophy or whatever, or is it really a different way of doing business? And of course, I put this one in bold, hint, hint. Right, so the point for me about continuous delivery, and this is going back to why this is interesting. So I'm a tools guy, right? So I can get motivated by gluing together 8 tools in a slightly smarter way than I did last time. And you will not see me until I've managed to make Jenkins or XR release or whatever do what I wanted to do. But ultimately, that's just me sitting in my little box. That's not all that interesting from a corporate perspective. And your very own Snehal Antani, who gave a great talk at a Splunk conference, I think, last year. If you haven't seen it, I'll send you the link or just Google for it. He made an excellent point. He said, Puppet or Chefs, I don't care. What matters, we're here to make life better for our customers. They ultimately pay our paychecks, whether that's internal customers, external customers. We need to change the way we do business in order to give them what we would consider to be a modern experience. Like if you can compare the way you order a feature nowadays and you get that delivered versus the way you can order a pizza and get that delivered, they're so far apart in terms of maturity, these two processes. So maybe we can use continuous delivery as a way to try to make software a slightly more modern experience. So, well, why would you do this? Well, I mean, apart from nobody wanting to say no to faster, better, cheaper, there's the obvious competitive pressure idea, and I'm sure at GE that is felt pretty strongly. If you have a health comparison, if your competitor has a health comparison website where they can compare 8 different providers or whatever, you better have it pretty soon as well, because otherwise people are going to go to the other one. It's a hot trend. Everybody likes to do what's cool right now. You read about these cool companies doing it. And there are some clear business values, right? And time to market, application quality, increasing customer awareness. That's what I was getting at. The competitive pressure, obviously, there's a shark picture. There's always a good moment to put a shark picture in a presentation. So feel the pressure. I was at a conference where, a vendor conference where a top 10 global bank CIO stood up in front of all his vendors and said, if we don't find a way to change the way we deliver in 5 years, we run the risk of disappearing. Which I don't think is a little true necessarily, but this is the pressure and the pain that a top 10 global bank feels that they're under. Now, one of the things that I think is very important and continuous delivery enthusiasts such as myself sometimes tend to forget is the link to something that's maybe much more common and popular. And I will try and make this link by pointing you to this quote. The underlining is for me. It's like, our highest priority is to satisfy the customer through early and continuous delivery, there's that phrase, of valuable software. I'm not going to do a quiz here because everybody already has a free t-shirt, but people recognize this? If you get this, excellent, then that's the jackpot, you win. This is principle number 1 from the Agile manifesto. So what this really means is that if you're not doing continuous delivery, you're not really doing Agile. All you're doing is putting code in a repository every 2 weeks, which is fun, but code in a repository, let me tell you, has 0 business value. Yeah? So, and of course I can say again, as I said at the beginning, it's very easy to stand up here and say, so you should be doing this, and you know that. It's like, well, how? That's why I'm here. But maybe take this away. don't think of continuous delivery as a technical process. Think of it as Agile done right. Think of it as Agile the way it's really meant to be. Agile is not buying a whiteboard and giving 3M a lot of money for colored stickies and then moving the stickies around and having a meeting when you're standing up instead of sitting down every morning. Agile is incrementally getting the most important thing out to your users quickly. So if you think about GE's, one of the potential goals of moving to cloud, it's not just cost efficiency, it's not just, we can standardize on stuff. This gives you a way to reach out to your customers faster. Plus, of course, if you buy all our tooling, it gets even better. But no, I mean, leaving that aside, this is, I think, one of the most important things, to recognize the relationship between continuous delivery and Agile. It's not a separate thing. Continuous delivery is principle number 1 in the Agile Manifesto. And then, of course, so I have huge sympathy with myself, but anybody else who has to try and keep up with this space, because Agile and Devops and continuous delivery, all these phrases are being thrown around. There's so many people jumping on the bandwagon. I mean, basically, there's nothing that is produced in IT ops nowadays that isn't a DevOps something. When, if you see a new screwdriver to open your rack, it's a DevOps screwdriver. So it's really difficult to figure out what all these things mean. Basically, there's a lot of overlapping messaging. It's really difficult to parse. Frankly, as far as I'm concerned, I don't care what you call it. We can have long and interesting philosophical discussions about the origins of DevOps and whether it's sort of customer-facing or more technical-facing or what the goals are, whatever. Basically, the most important thing is that I think you should know what you're trying to get out of it. Because one of the questions I ask often and the answers I get are, why are you doing DevOps? Because it's DevOps. Or why are you doing continuous delivery? Well, because it's continuous delivery. No, 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 no. DevOps and continuous delivery and Agile and CI, none of these things are goals in themselves. They are means to achieve a certain thing. And if you know what that thing is, then you can decide whether these practices work for you or not. But don't do it because other people have done it. And I mean, ultimately, that's, again, a very trivial statement to make. Don't copy what the masters do. Copy the way the masters think. What I'm going to try and do here is to try to give some insight into the way I think the masters think. All right. So much for the intro. So now the 3 kind of pillars that I would consider for continuous delivery, or indeed any other practice. This is a very general term. All of these 3 terms have had centuries of research going into them, so there's all kinds of ways of defining them, and we could spend most of the rest of today and tomorrow arguing about the definitions. For the purposes of this talk, let's look at them this way. Culture is a set of values, beliefs, traditions. Practices are behaviors and actions which derive from these values and beliefs, and tooling are things that you use to carry out these practices. So typically, given the way I just said it, the causal chain looks a little bit like this. You have culture. Culture is expressed through certain practices. Those are carried out using tooling. That's just what I said all over again, but with pretty pictures and arrows. And to give an example of how generic it is, let's consider this. This is marshmallow roasting. So for me, coming from Europe, one of the weird traditions that I was confronted with when I came here to the States was these gooey white balls of stuff. But no, I mean going, camping and sharing, the experience around a campfire, and that is culture. That's just like something we do, in the summer. We go every year. I go out to Utah. I go camping out there, beautiful, and we have a campfire like this. We get very spoiled nowadays. Everybody drives up and seems like 4-star catering, but whatever. Anyway, and then one of the things that you do, that's the culture, one of the practices you have is to sit around the campfire and roast marshmallows. And unsurprisingly, this being America, you don't just do that with a stick. There is an implement to do this. There's this thing. It's called the real roaster. Ha, ha, ha. Isn't that funny? It's on Amazon. It's $9.99 or something. So it basically works like a fishing rod. So you can kind of roll your marshmallow into the fire, and then you can retract it. Amazing. I'm sure it only works for 5 minutes. Brilliant, right? So naive me thinking that you can do this just like manually. Anyway, so a bit about culture. Why am I hammering on about culture? Because once things reach cultural levels, they're incredibly resilient. Like if the real roaster breaks, as I said, I'm sure it does within like a week, people are not going to say, all right, well, that's it. No more marshmallows. Time to go home. No, you fix things, right? You go and you pull a twig off a branch or something like that, or rig something up. And once you want to do something, once it's a cultural and belief and internally driven thing, you will try to make it and keep it working through a lot of adverse circumstances. as an aside, there is, of course, a risk that when things become too strongly embedded in a culture, you get a lot of groupthink, and it becomes difficult to think alternatively. So, a challenge with all these things is to not get dogmatic about them and to realize that because they're not goals but means to an end, there might be other ways of doing that. And it's an interesting discussion about some ways to try to motivate this. The problem is, of course, that culture is very, very hard to enforce from the top down. Ask the Soviet Union. Look at history. It's very easy to say, well, once we have culture, then it's fun, we're done. And in most organizations, and from what I've heard, GE is no exception in this case, this culture isn't in place. The whole point of me being here is to try to motivate you to think about that this might be a good thing. So we're at the beginning of this journey rather than at the end. It's not a history lesson. So what can we do about this? How can we start, what does it even mean to think this way, and how can we start going about it? So let's look at these three pillars in a slightly different way. Here's our original drawing. We had culture expressed through practices carried out using tooling. And now we play a fun little visual trick. We invert the arrows. Amazing, huh? No, so let's look at them this way. Let's talk about tooling enabling practices giving rise to culture. So apart from a nice visual trick in PowerPoint, what am I trying to do here? See, that's how good I am in PowerPoint. I'm trying to invert the causal relationships. I'm trying to talk about, can we look at bootstrapping, going from the bottom up, and building ourselves some kind of CD culture, or a culture in which we achieve what we're trying to do, and namely serve our customers better, be better than the competition, make them happier, and so on. Why am I starting with tooling and practices? Well, I'm starting with tooling and practices because they're, compared to all the other stuff, they're the easy bit. Most of the tools that we're talking about are free or very low cost. You don't need to buy a mainframe or get an entire private cloud to run them. Typically, as Uday will tell you all about, Jenkins tends to run somewhere here on a server that someone found under a desk, which is another problem. But, very easy to get this stuff started. It's pretty low risk until you start to get to production, obviously. But you're not going to burn through enormous amounts of money or miss all kinds of project deadlines until you get totally locked into this. So you can skunkworks this stuff. This can be done by a bunch of motivated people in a relatively short amount of time. You can do lunch and learns. You can do a whole bunch of things to get something off the ground. And given most of the processes in place, you can achieve some very, very quick, easy wins that demonstrate that there is value going in this direction. So I had a discussion yesterday with someone who was talking about, getting Siebel installed. It's a problem that a certain team has. They need to run end-to-end tests. How do we get this thing up and running? Well, the first thing it turns out is that nobody knows how it's actually installed because the people who originally installed it are no longer here. So that, there's obviously some challenges that automation won't immediately solve. But once you've done that, once you've got a provisioning tool, Michael will talk later about Chef, and I know you're using that quite heavily. There are a bunch of others. Then you have an immediate win. You can go from 3 weeks to installing this environment, or how long it takes, to maybe a couple of hours. And that's a great immediate benefit. People can say, great, wow, look. And then you can start to think, well, what is now possible? Because we can do this in so much shorter time. Maybe we can run the tests more often. Maybe we can push the testing up the pipeline. So all kinds of things become possible when you have the initial skunkworks, if you like, automation in place. But there is a risk with this skunkworks style automation. And in order to demonstrate this, let me tell you a story from a company I used to work at. So we were come onto this project. Inevitably, we were, the project was supposed to have been delivered yesterday. Everything was broken. There was a mess of code that nobody really understood. They'd fallen out with, all the nightmares in one. And so, a lot of us who came onto this project had worked in organizations where some sort of CI/CD setup was in place. And we were, well, not horrified, but we were like, oh my God, this is going to be really difficult if we don't have this. But we didn't have any time to work on it ourselves. So we got some budget, and we hired some consultants, some friends of ours to build this. And oh my God, that was, you see, that's what happens when you drink and don't watch. I'm going the wrong way. This is like an immediate preview of the presentation. So if you saw all that, then you can go. No, so the story here is that we got our friends to build this great pipeline setup. And what then happened is that it was working, it was beautiful, and we were watching the dashboards, and we got fast feedback. And then something started going wrong with some of the functional tests, and we weren't, we were pretty certain in production we weren't really seeing anything, so we were pretty certain that it was some kind of artifact of the tests, or maybe the machine on which they were set up, or some version of fitness had changed, or whatever. And then we don't have time to bother with this. So slowly we became desensitized to the flickering red flag, and we then decided we were going to switch those functional tests off. And so the whole broken window syndrome, you can kind of see where this is going. Actually, I call it nowadays like the laptop open syndrome, because if you're a conference, first person. So what I'm trying to get at is that it's very quick. You can have a beautiful tooling framework, and if you don't feel that it's important for the tooling framework to be maintained, it will slowly start to crumble. And by the time we got to delivering the thing, we basically were ignoring the red balls or the blue balls to a large extent. We were looking at kind of production data to get our input. Half the tests weren't running anymore, and so on and so forth. So, tragic story, of course. But basically the lesson from all this is tooling by itself only goes so far. And what I said was, the story I told was about tooling breaking. But this is not just about tooling actually breaking. It's also about becoming unfit for purpose, or not remaining fit for purpose. I don't know, those who were around when somebody in your organization decided that it might be a good idea to write a mobile app for something. Well, I was like in the first days of the web. I was committing to a bank's production website from my laptop, like mobile. Hired some college student. They'll develop something in Xcode and ship it up to whatever. There was no need to have like stringent certification and testing and all this stuff 5, 6, 8 years ago. That's changed dramatically for every company. Like a 3-star, 2-star, 1-star rating on the App Store is like a snafu. It's like all hands on deck. What on earth are we going to do to fix this? So the level of quality, the level of inspection, the kind of what you need to do nowadays in the mobile space, for instance, has changed dramatically. And so in other words, the tooling needs to evolve to remain fit for purpose, and of course to stay up and running. And that's not easy, because it's very easy to invest the time initially and then pretend, hope, believe that it sort of magically runs itself. And that just isn't true. And that's what I call quick win chasm, because it's the idea that, look, we've got this beautiful thing up and running, we've developed these great benefits, it's shiny, 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 now we go on to do other stuff, and then inevitably everything comes crashing down sooner or later. So the 5 things that we learned, or that I've learned having seen this a few times, try to cross this, is to first of all get management buy-in, because these tooling networks don't run themselves for free. I know there's a lot of people in operations here. I don't know where exactly in your organization the responsibility lies for running this kind of like dev support, CD support tooling. That will depend a little bit on what you see its purpose and its business criticality to be. But you will need to have a project or something along those lines, a billing code, those evil things, where you will be able to dedicate time to keep all this stuff up and running. And that really only works if the management knows about it and is willing to sign off and admit that doing good stuff unfortunately costs some money. Find someone who's been there. It's very, very difficult to build and maintain a nice, useful tooling environment if you don't have someone who knows what it feels like to work in one. Otherwise, you've got the elephant problem all over again. Everybody has read different blog posts about what CD should look like, and you're blindly trying to figure out what it is. You can't really do any goal-directed work. So whether you get in a consultant, you're doing it because you're having an event like this, but make sure you work with people within your own organization externally who have some experience, and they can impart not just some sort of measure of understanding, but generally also a measure of enthusiasm for why this is good. Create champions, well, that's all part of the same thing. Don't make this the thing that somebody has to do outside their day job in their lunch break if they happen to have time, or don't happen to have to pick their kids up from school or whatever. Somebody needs to be motivated, titled, whatever, to actually look after this stuff. And this is an important thing, and this tooling becomes very important. This is what you use to get your stuff to your customers. So it needs to stay up and running. And then, make things visible, communicate. Those are basically the same thing. But don't be afraid that when you start out, things are not going to be perfect. This is a journey. Of course, you have to make people understand where you're trying to go. But there will be ups and downs at the beginning. and show that. And if you do things right, then things will get better over time, and you should be proud about the development. And if things don't go right, that's also important to have the data and make this visible, because then you can reevaluate whether this is the right thing for you. All right, so I still have 25 minutes, so that should be fine. Let's talk a little bit about some practical things. So much for the nice high-level story. What kind of things, and the slides are there online, so you don't have to take notes here, although I'm very grateful. Flash photography, also highly recommended, please. I like standing up here on stage. I had to switch off my phone. I have a bit of a production emergency. My mother's email isn't working, so that's like, but she will call me later. Okay, tooling, code review. This is not really typically considered part of CI or CD, but I'm putting this in here because it also helps you think about where this process starts. And Uday was saying a lot about catching errors early. This is also about increasing shared understanding. I was at Guild, the flash sale people, like shoes for whatever, for a week or a day. And not necessarily the best example in terms of comparison between G and Guild, but they're struggling a little bit, or they're struggling. They're doing a microservices setup right now, very hip, very trendy, very popular. Don't call them SOA because, people react badly to that, even though it's potentially the same thing. But, they said one of the ways they try to manage all these dependencies, because that's a hard problem, is they make sure developers see what other developers are doing. And so code review starts as being something that can not only help you catch errors early, but can also increase shared understanding of what's going on. And that can be important to making this thing better. Continuous integration. Well, I won't belabor this point. We've just seen an entire interesting presentation on that. One thing I should say, I'll just repeat, like with Agile or CI or CD or Devops, there is no, CI isn't a tool. It's not running Jenkins. CI is a practice. CI is what it says, continuously integrate, which typically means, if you ask someone like Jess Humble or whatever, merge stuff to master. Yeah? That's what integration is. Don't have 8 different components and you only find out how they work when you're about to deploy them to production. Integrate them regularly and let a server do the heavy lifting for you, because it becomes really boring to do this stuff by hand. Deployment. Obviously, my ideal recommendation is that you all go out and download our tool and do deployments that way. But frankly, the reality is it doesn't matter how you do them. What matters is that you don't do them manually anymore. Not because I'm an automation vendor, but because beyond a shadow of a doubt, manual deployments are error-prone, slow, time-consuming, all the things that we don't want. If you discover that you can't automatically install a piece of software, then you have a totally different problem coming up. But in order to do CI, CD, accelerate your pace of delivery, you will need to be able to deploy your software often and reliably, and you can pretty much only do that with automation. Testing and quality. You will need some kind of testing tooling, and the reason I call it quality is because, testing as and of itself, we have all these, I think we had a brainstorm, 27 different categories of test tools or types of tests you could run. Who cares ultimately what they're all called? What matters is when you're about to hit that big red button, go live, are you confident that that thing is good or not? And whatever information you need to be reasonably confident about hitting that red button or automatically allowing the stuff to go to production, that's the information you need this tooling to gather. So it's really quality and risk information more than it is test information. I'll talk a little bit about some strategies for actually starting to write tests a little later. And maybe another point on this one, which I'll belabor later if I have time, it's not just about quality before you go live. No, if you think about, say, a modern consumer experience, where did I go yesterday? I was trying to find somewhere to eat. I went to Yelp. What is Yelp? It gives me feedback about stuff after it's in production. Like, once you've delivered the food to the customer, and then they tell you whether they like it or not. Do I care about whether they like their entire delivery pipeline of getting the food to me on the plate? They don't care really that much about that. For them, internally, that's important. For me, it's important to look at the end result. So think about quality in testing, not just the stuff that happens before you go live, but maybe more critically, the stuff you do after it goes live in order to figure out whether the stuff that you built is actually any good. Provisioning. Well, certainly for those of you on the cloud, the ops side of the house, this is going to be, I'm sure, one of the big parts of this initiative. We've got thousands and thousands and millions potentially of servers or containers or whatever the technology the day after tomorrow will happen to be. How on earth do we get those up and running in a stable state, keep them there if necessary, spin them up, scale them up, scale them down? You'll hear much more about this a little later, but that's obviously a key piece of tooling to have. And orchestration. And again, Uday talked about this a little bit. You can come and watch XR release, same flavor of something slightly different, but all this delivery pipeline stuff I've talked about, it's nice conceptually, and we can draw it on a whiteboard, or we can draw it on the wall and make a big Visio diagram, but that doesn't do anything. The Visio diagram isn't automated, right? So you have to have some piece of tooling in which you can actually write down or document the steps in your pipeline as something that will actually execute itself, and that will give insight, visibility, traceability, improvement data, all the kind of stuff that is important to making a process better over time. Monitoring, well, that's related to the comment I was just making about finding out what happens once the stuff is in production. And of course, monitoring is one very important aspect of that, typically at the lowest level, like are the disks overheating or whatever. But of course, monitoring goes up the chain. And I'm sure there's a bunch of APM tools that are in use here. There's also some other interesting monitoring tools that are really at the kind of feature customer level. We're seeing new types of industries basically come around, like called customer experience management, I think is what Gartner calls it. So you basically need all these types of tools. Right, so practices. And you'll notice there's strong relations between these because, after all, I showed you the 3 magic boxes. We're talking about tooling giving rise to practices and then engendering a type of culture. This is really an agile practice to some extent. It's a piece of common sense. Keep changes small. Why keep changes small? Well, because there's less stuff to break. And because when you break it, it's easier to figure out where the problem was. And this is ultimately a statistics problem more than anything else. Feature or regression problems, if you change 100 variables and something goes wrong, it's very hard to mathematically or scientifically or human, brain power-wise, figure out which of the variables actually caused the problem. That was exactly the question we heard a second ago. So change fewer variables. If you're doing proper scientific experiments, ideally you change 1 variable at a time. Even that's not foolproof, but it's much better to keep the changes small. It makes things faster, and makes it much easier for you to determine what goes on. It's not trivial, of course, and this goes back to why are we doing all this cloud stuff? Because back in the day when, it took 3 weeks to set up an environment, it was totally infeasible to set up an environment to test 1 change. That's where big releases came from. That's where big bang stuff came from. But now that we can do this in 6 minutes or a couple of hours, we can start to think differently about what's possible. Ultimately, that's what I'm here to try to convey. All right, quality before functionality. So maybe a slightly oddly phrased point. Really, the point I'm trying to make here is that it's not good enough if it just, one person in the test team clicked on the button and the icon appeared in the right place and it's done, right? This thing needs to work when it's being hit by 1,000 users, and it needs to meet some sort of basic levels of what you define as being a good enough feature. So not just functionality-wise, but does it impact the performance of the system or the stability? If we have certain code quality guidelines or whatever, all this stuff needs to be met. And it's a difficult one, certainly from the product manager's perspective. Yeah, but it works. I saw it in the demo. Just put it out there. We'll figure it out later. Very tempting to do. But over time, we all know that ends up in disaster. So it's very important to notice that you have certain standards about quality for a reason, and that it benefits everybody to try to stick to them. If they're too stringent, then you might need to relax them a little bit, but that needs to be a conscious trade-off. You can't say, well, everything has to work perfectly in production, but we can't spend any time on testing or verifying it up front, which is typically the case. Putting tests up front, well, that's related to the same thing. Really, early testing, it's all very well to do the tests all the way 2 minutes before you go to production, but you should be running this test a lot earlier, because not only will you catch errors earlier, you will also know when to stop. So this is a problem I can confess to as a developer quite often. You write a piece of code and you think, yeah, but really, that's only a specific case. We could make it a bit more generic. And then you refactor stuff and you add more configurable options. And then so by the end, you've built this framework to move an icon around or something. We don't want to do that. because that's not very efficient. It's fun as a developer, but from an organizational perspective, it's not very smart. So having a test that allows you to unambiguously say pretty quickly, it's good enough, then we should stop working on it, and we move on to the next thing. And this is true whether you're doing application-level features or indeed whether you're trying to figure out a provisioning solution. Like, what are we trying to achieve? You know, if we want to provision the environment in 6 hours, then if it does it in 5 hours, then it's good enough. And of course, we could go and refactor and optimize the way the provisioning tool works to bring it down to 3 hours. But until we set ourselves that as a goal, we should move on to other things. We've got plenty of fish to fry, all of us. Everybody involved early, so this is really a DevOps-y type thought. It doesn't help if you have developers working on a laptop. Well, I'll tell a real story. So my girlfriend was working at a company, big publishing company, and they were building this media-based system, and they were developing, and of course they had a local development environment, and they were running Cassandra, and it was running in single server mode, because that's the default. When you download it, you install it single server. When they were trying to run it in production, guess what? They realized that, of course, in production it had to run clustered. And then all kinds of really bad stuff started happening. And what went wrong here fundamentally? It's not that it's hard to run clustered Cassandra on a server, on a dev server. It wasn't trivial enough. Developers, me at least, lazy by nature. So you have to make it very easy for them to get a production-like environment accessible. But they didn't know. And they didn't know because they'd never had the discussion at the beginning of the project. So how is this stuff actually going to run when it goes live? Getting everybody involved early can minimize some of these problems. Developers will actually understand under what kind of constraints their software will run in production. And that can have huge impacts on how you design stuff. If you know about the latency between different servers in your environment, you might make totally different architectural choices than if you assume everything's going to run on a laptop. No more code than necessary. Well, I've already talked about this point. Ongoing user dialogue. So that's back to the more the consumer side of things. What we can do with CD is not just have a more efficient plumbing, system, pipeline system to get stuff out there. It's actually giving us the opportunity to improve the stuff that goes through the pipeline. But the only way we can do that is by actually figuring out what the reaction is to what's coming out the end. And that doesn't have to be like a feedback form, like, do you like this? Vote up or down. Some of the features that we write are, fulfilling some kind of legislative requirements or meeting some kind of technical specifications or doing things to improve the performance of the system. But when we put that feature in the pipeline, we should have some kind of notion of what it is that we're trying to do when it comes out the other end. And ideally, we go measure that and then figure out whether that really worked. If that sounds totally crazy, and it does to a lot of people I speak to in IT, think about the way marketing works. Like we all have colleagues who do exactly this today. This is not pie in the sky stuff. Software has enabled marketing to become a totally different business. It's no longer people sitting in a room and coming up with weird ideas and then, we'll throw it out there and see what happens. It's totally data-driven science. Continuous delivery can make software delivery a data-driven science. So we have to apply some of the same thinking to software delivery. Delivery tooling is serious tooling. Well, you heard about Jenkins Operations Center. Michael, I'm sure, will talk about some of the things Chef does in this space. Once this stuff becomes critical to your ability to reach out to your customers, it's no longer something that you can afford to have running under your desk. Because if it breaks, you have a serious problem. It needs to be treated like any kind of serious operational tooling. Backed up, redundant, running on real servers, with some kind of support plan around it, et cetera, et cetera. And it's horribly boring, but you need to think about that. Culture, right now I need to speed up because this big clock is not letting me rest. So we can always do better. That's part of the anti-groupthink thing. It doesn't mean that at any given point in time you will stop all the work you're doing because somebody had an idea on how to improve. But people should obviously be encouraged that the process we have isn't perfect. It doesn't come from some higher authority, and it's the only way things can be done. And don't worry, it's always going to be like this. It's the best solution we have right now to a particular problem. And if the problem is big enough and we have a way of doing it better, then we should foster thinking that this is allowed and possible and not slap people down for saying, no, look over here. You want to encourage a kind of creative mentality. Learning to talk more about, instead of like, well, we build code and then you run it for them. So we're all in this together. I as a developer am working with my colleagues in operations, and our cumulative job is to get something running for us, namely our customers. That's the easiest to do when you're actually a customer of your own tools, but think of everybody involved. We're all trying to be in this together. That's organizationally very hard to do in some companies, depending on your corporate structure, and I can talk at long length about other possible approaches to this sort of DevOps idea, more rigorous notion of platform boundaries. But just in terms of thinking, as a developer, I've been proud of writing beautiful code and having my repository layout clean. Why was I proud of that? Well, because I had so little ability to impact what actually happened to the stuff when it ran in production that it didn't make sense for me to care about it, because I would have driven myself crazy and it would have made zero effect whatsoever. And we don't want to be there. Like, I shouldn't be proud of a beautifully formatted piece of code in a repo. I should be proud of a wonderfully running service that my users are proud of. I'll tell you the most embarrassing thing that can happen to you as a developer, the most painful, emotional thing, sitting in a bar or a restaurant, and somebody at the next table is using the feature you built, and they say, oh, this sucks. Ugh, it doesn't work, and it's slow. Like, I've been there. It's horrible, right? That motivates you to change stuff, especially if that's like your mother's friend or something like that. But, and your mother said, oh, look, he built this new thing. Try it out. That really hurts because, you see the person you're working for, and you feel some kind of bond, and then your professional pride comes out. But you can only do that if you have a feeling that we're kind of in this process together. If it's like, well, that's their fault, because they must have installed it on the wrong server. No wonder it takes so long. Well, I have nothing to do with this. I'm just going to go and order another beer. That doesn't help think about making things better together. Us includes the business. Okay, that's an important one that's related to what I'm saying, because in a lot of cases the customer is the business, and they need to work together. There's a challenge here, because in many cases the business doesn't necessarily they want everything faster, better, cheaper, but they're not really willing to invest the time that takes in order to control this process. So that's a challenge. I'm really going to speed up now because my stories are running away with me. Tools work for the team. Again, much harder to do in large organizations than in small organizations. It's pretty easy to mandate a tool suite because you can do the POCs and you can have your evaluation checklists. But tools should be things that the team uses to get the right results in a better way, not something that is forced upon you and that you have to use whether you like it or not. Because then you're letting the tools dictate how you work, and you probably know better how you work effectively than the tools do. There's lots of interesting research in safety critical systems that I'm sure some of you are aware of about the dangers of black box automation, basically constraining the choices people can make. Because we're getting better at AI, but let's face it, in really tough situations, we still haven't bettered human intuition and thinking yet. We have in repetitive, boring situations like deployment. That's why we build tools to do that kind of stuff. So this is a variant on the nobody goes home if the build is broken mantra. It's like, I'm not saying everybody should feel this because that's a bit of an unnatural thing to do, but you need to have somebody on your teams that feels bad when the ability to deliver software is broken because your delivery pipeline is crashed. Unfortunately, for my own sleep log, I used to be that person. I'm that person for a couple of open source projects. If the thing doesn't work and the server's not reachable and we can't build, it drives me nuts. I will log in, whatever the time of the hour of the day, I will try and fix it. It's just personal, internal motivation. But that's ultimately what we kind of need as a culture to try and keep things running. All right, getting started. How do we get started? Well, the first thing is you need a baseline. And very often people forget that in their enthusiasm to use the tools. Then we don't remember where we came from. And you ask people, so what was it actually like before we started with the tools? And people will have all kinds of anecdotes about how terrible it was and how they once spent 8 hours trying to figure out who fat-fingered a particular deployment script or whatever. But very difficult to go to management and say, look, well, we had those anecdotes, now we have this. Know where you're starting from. How long is it taking you right now to do whatever process it is you're trying to improve, whether that's to go from dev to prod, or to set up an environment, or to analyze a test failure, or whatever. Because that's the data that will allow you to decide whether it's really getting better, or whether you're going in the right direction. Define incremental goals. Yeah, it's easy to read a blog post about 5 people in a college dorm who have 8 servers running on Amazon, and oh, look, everybody commits and it's straight in production, no problem. But don't let yourself get carried away with that. I had an interesting discussion in a Devops meetup. Somebody talked about a very large financial organization that went from 1 or 2 releases a year. No, yeah, it was 2 releases a year to a release a week in production. He said it took them 3 years to get there. So we are talking about timescales that are not like tomorrow. I can share some other interesting stories about what he said actually made the shift possible. But this is not something that's going to happen immediately. So think in terms of incremental goals. We do not boil the ocean. You have to look at improvements that you can make in a reasonable time frame, a couple of months, a couple of sprints, whatever. And start with tooling generally, because very often if you look at your baseline, you will find that one of the immediate incremental goals is that you can optimize 2 or 3 parts of that process by automating certain things. And then pick a tool to automate those things. Don't pick a tool that will automate everything eventually. There is no CD in a rack. This is it. This is CD. You just need to switch it on, and no, that's not. We have a lot of 3-letter vendors who are really good at selling that kind of message. But if you look in practice, it's just not true. I skipped my last slide. All right. So now it gets progressively more difficult to do in reality. Testing and quality. Well, the main problem with testing, in my experience, certainly in large organizations where you're not talking about a greenfield situation, but about existing applications, is not that people don't recognize the value of tests. Everybody understands that more tests better, but that nobody wants to invest the time or the money to actually backfill all these tests, because it's boring. It takes a lot of time, and nobody's quite certain whether you're testing the right things or not. Sometimes people don't know how the system should work, which is an especially interesting problem. Basically, you need buy-in to do this. And unfortunately, it's like with home insurance or any other insurance. Most of the time, people are more willing to invest in flood insurance after their basement was just flooded, which is not, the equivalent would be to say, people realize the value of testing after they've had a high-profile production outage. It's pretty painful, especially bad if you're trying to motivate people to go to CD. 2 or 3 high-profile production outages in a week will kill your CD project stone dead. So this is really a matter of buy-in and trying to find a way to invest in these tests early. The one thing I should say about the tests that's very important is, really, I should stop drinking water. This is really bad. And now I can't go back. Anyway, it doesn't matter. I can do the remainder of those slides like this. Oh, there we are. Thank you. So there is a big tendency, because we have these well-known test categories and we have these well-known test tools, to think, okay, well, what do we have? We first have unit tests, and then we have functional tests, and then we have regression tests. So we're going to have to backfill all of them. All right, 100,000 unit tests. Let's get someone who's really good at unit tests, and then they will work. And then we do the next one. And to me, that's totally the wrong way to do it. Because you're thinking, if you like, in terms of columns, the different types of tests. But what is the point of having 100,000 new unit tests if your main use case still fails in production because of some functional glitch that you could have caught with a functional test? Well, those unit tests haven't helped you at all. The important thing is not to look at columnar blocks of types of tests. It's to look at your use cases. What's the worst thing that could happen to that application? You can't log in. It doesn't come up. All right, so we'll write it's all the tests that we need, unit, functional, performance, regression, security, whatever, to verify this basic use case. Then at least we've covered our most important priority. And then we can add another use case. And that might not require all these different types of tests. Might be the different ones are what we need for that one. And that's not, that means you need to have testers or people developing the tests, the teams who have skills in different areas. But this is a much better way of gradually building up your confidence level than just modularly going through, well, now we've got to do 10,000 regression tests. Adapt your architecture to allow for smaller changes. As you can see, progressively very hard. I know this is going on. But you can't have changes small if it takes 8 hours to compile and you've got a jar or an EAR file with basically the entire internet in it. That's a natural ceiling to your ability to move fast. And there's plenty of interesting papers about trying to break down monolithic architectures, split off little bits, test virtualization. I highly recommend looking at these kind of approaches. The hardest one is full-time business focus. Like, what CD does ultimately is it gives people the ability to react very quickly to customer or business requirements and user input, and to get the stuff out there quickly. And if you have a business that's used to saying, well, we'll speak to you, have a meeting at the beginning of March, and then in October we'll have another meeting to complain about all the stuff you didn't deliver, that frequency of input and interaction isn't going to work. Like you can't, if somebody's going to drive the race car, they have to be sitting at the wheel. They can't be going making coffee in the trailer. And that's difficult to get across. And typically once the business can see the value in what they're doing, they're willing to dedicate the time. But initially, you have to get them to understand that we are no longer doing once every 6 months meetings because we just don't get the right input we need. All right, so 7 seconds to go. I've just made it. There's more info from me. You can look at our blog, our website. You can learn more about all our cool tools. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you, Andrew. That was great. I think we do have time for like 1 or 2 questions real quick.
Don't be scared. Oh, there's one in the back.
You got one?
You get a free Rise of the Bots t-shirt.
Can you tell us more about not boiling the ocean? Because as GE, sometimes we have the tendency of going for the perfect solution that, by the way, will be delivered in 9 months if we are lucky. And sometimes, you know, we cannot really wait for so long.
Oh, now I have to be careful, depending on what I say, that I make it out of this room alive. So, well, I think one of the big challenges in a large organization is that the temptation is to have some sort of centralized, you know, let's ignore the details. We'll just have to think about something that works best for all of us. And that's very hard to do, especially if you're just going to impose it. You know, it's all stick, basically. Very little carrot, all stick. And that doesn't work very well unless, you know, unless you allow people to say, well, if we're going to implement this architecture, then we are going to fail these project deadlines because there's no way we can meet the project deadlines because we have this weird system that doesn't work with this centralized architecture. If you allow people to do that, fair enough. Then you can have your standardized setup for everything. But what I've seen work well in some organizations, we were recently at Accenture, they were doing something like this, is they said, okay, you know, we're going to come up with some kind of centralized idea based on feedback we've gathered, and you can use it. And you know, when you use it, we'll give you some incentives, we'll give you some discounted running costs or whatever. And we, by the way, will guarantee that you meet all the requirements that we have company-wide, like you know, security, auditing, whatever. But you're free to do it your own way. If you need to, if you think you can do it better, by all means, go find your own tools, run your own data center, but you will have to meet all these requirements. And if it turns out that you're doing it at a cost that's significantly different to what we could deliver, you are going to have to explain why that cost is actually worthwhile. And then you have a bit of a carrot and a stick. It's much more of a sort of, that's the problem we face as a product vendor. You don't have to use our tools. We have to motivate you to use our tools. So that only answered part of your question, I think. If you're going to go for some kind of global approach, it's much more effective if you can say to people, yes, you can use this, but you don't have to use it. But if you're not going to use it, think about whether you're really going to come up with a better solution. I mean, I think the other thing, you know, about making small steps, it depends a little bit on the nature of the initiative that's going on. Obviously, if you're in a departmental area where, you know, it's usually much easier, well, usually I say, easier to ask for a budget for a team for 3 months or 6 months or 2 months or whatever, than it is to ask for 400 people for an entire year or whatever to build something. So often that actually works better, and people have an intuitive notion that it works better. But I guess, and unfortunately I don't have the proper answer to this, you know, there is this, so okay, maybe let me try and phrase this one way. There is one interesting part of CD where CD is usually about optimizing a particular thing. But at some point, like in any statistical setup, you get a sort of diminishing returns problem. And then you have to make another big leap. So that's true of product development as well. You can have an idea, and that's that one big idea, and then you can use this customer feedback to fine-tune it. But at some point, you need to have another big idea. Some interesting information on how that works. But going back to your like boil the ocean thing, maybe the idea of this global platform is the big idea. But rather than setting it as, you know, you shall all do this in 9 months, it's like, you know, this is the kind of setup that we would like. This is functionally what we would like to achieve. Everybody now go away and make that work and use our tools, or if you have to deviate, but then explain. But, you know, you may find that you don't need to go all the way there. as I said, it's important that what the goal is that you're trying to achieve, rather than thinking in terms of like we're all going to have to implement these 8 tools because that's what corporate gave us. A very roundabout answer to your question, but I hope.
That was all right. You did all right.
I
I think you'll survive. Yeah. You tiptoed the minefield pretty good. All right. Thanks everybody. Thanks Andrew.